Forrest Claypool was the CEO of the Chicago Public School System from 2015 to 2017. And before that, he was the CEO of the Chicago Transit Authority from 2011 to 2015. Before that, he was a Cook County Commissioner and was Chief of Staff under Richard M. Daley, Mayor of Chicago and subject of this book, The Daley Show, covering Mayor Daley's 22-year reign in Chicago City Hall. Forrest, thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate you having me.
So, three former employers of yours, CPS, the Chicago Transit Authority, and the City of Chicago itself, are confronting some extraordinary fiscal challenges. Let me start with CPS. They, of course, passed a budget recently that gets us through the current fiscal year, avoiding the payday loan, but of course there's still a massive structural deficit that they must tackle in the coming years. I don't think I need to tell you the Chicago Teachers Union has attained extraordinary power, and even in the face of sharply declining enrollment, is very unlikely to willingly accept any school closings, not without a fight. How do we see this playing out over the next 3 to 5 years? And is Chapter 9 a real possibility, provided, of course, that the state authorizes CPS to declare bankruptcy?
Yeah, great questions. The state would have to authorize bankruptcy because it's not authorized currently under state law. And I do think there's a power play underway with Stacey Davis Gates, the head of the Chicago Teachers Union, literally attempting to, the district's already bankrupt, but essentially forcing the governor's hand by refusing to support and undermining any sort of cost efficiency elements or any sort of right sizing of the school district, while also demanding this huge, new spending, which they were able to achieve when they had full control of the school board under Mayor Johnson, who, as you know, was a former organizer for the union. Even as the enrollment was shrinking dramatically, the spending was rising dramatically, and most of that funding was coming from the federal COVID relief dollars that had been provided by the Biden administration, which are now running out this year or early next year. So it's kind of set up a situation where Governor Pritzker and the legislature are going to have to make some decisions, and I suspect that they may want to. It may be that the old idea of a state financial authority to oversee the schools may rear its head again. Illinois unlike many states, does not allow municipalities or their subunits to declare bankruptcy, even if they are in fact insolvent, as CPS is and as the city of Chicago is. And definition of insolvency, I should remind our listeners, is the inability to pay all of your debts. So both the city and the schools cannot pay all of their debts. That includes pensions. That's just a mathematical reality. So it makes them actually truly insolvent. Bankruptcy is a little different. They're staying current, obviously, by borrowing money to pay bills. They are getting one-time revenue sources like TIF surpluses that won't last forever. And the bond market continues to allow a certain amount of borrowing to pay operating expenses, which I think is also ultimately will come to an end. So they're on borrowed time about being actually bankrupt itself, not being able to pay current bills or teacher salaries or the like. So at some point, I do think the state will have to be involved. The question is how and in what way.
So CTA is also confronting a budget shortfall of more than $700 million the next fiscal year. Ridership levels remain about 3/4 of pre-COVID levels. CTA is, I argue, on the edge of a downward spiral. And this, to me, is the product of a real failure on the part of Chicago's public leaders to level with residents about what work from home would mean to public transit. Nobody talked about fundamentally redesigning our city to meet traffic flows. But in New York, we see that politicians there took the bold step of tolling roadways into Manhattan during peak hours. Of course, many New York politicians put their butts on the line to get this done. And after they got it done, after they went through the political pain, it's proven to be both popular and effective in boosting public transit ridership. Why can't we act with similar courage? And is it too late to save CTA?
No, I don't think it's at all too late to save CTA, but it does require political leadership and good management, which both of which have been in short supply in recent years. Obviously New York's unique in terms of the demand in Midtown Manhattan and Manhattan, and we don't have the luxury here of trying to tax suburbanites coming in. We want them to come in and spend money and add to the economic vitality. What's missing at the CTA is simply the will to match expenditures against actual demands, and a huge opportunity was missed with the pandemic money, which could have been used to painlessly shrink the size of the CTA footprint to match the actual ridership demand. As you mentioned, it's never gotten above 3/4 of what it was before, and that what they need to do is bring the provision of services to match the actual demand. Now that we live in the world of remote work, where who knows, anywhere from 20 to a third of the people don't actually come into work regularly anymore. The fact that we haven't done that, the fact there's been no political will to do that, is remarkable, and it's really at the core of the problem that's facing the CTA. And those dollars could be used instead to improve cleanliness of stations, to improve public safety, in terms of the fear of crime and things that would actually add to ridership, boost revenue. And instead, they're just kind of they're propping up the old model before the pandemic.
And the city of Chicago itself, as Alderman Bill Conway has noted, if Chicago public schools are not going to be taking on the $175 million pension obligation to non-teachers employed in the public school system, well, then the city must. That's another $175 million that the city has to budget for now, and it's already confronting a structural deficit north of $1 billion. Seems pretty clear to me how we got here. City pension contributions have now quintupled from 2014 levels. How on earth, absent a constitutional amendment to allow for Tier 1 pension reform, can the city avoid bankruptcy?
Yeah, I think the answer to that is that we have one last chance, I think, to do that, and that one thing about the Illinois Constitution, which as flawed as it has a provision that every 10 years, voters must be allowed to vote on whether or not to hold a new constitutional convention. So in 2028, not this election, but the one after, voters will be asked to approve a new constitutional convention or reject it. If they can be convinced to approve a new one, then there will be a new constitutional convention will convene in 29, which is still quite a ways out, but would allow for a restructuring of the Constitution to deal with this crisis, because the Illinois Supreme Court has otherwise struck down as unconstitutional all other efforts by the state legislature to deal in pension reform. So that's in my opinion, that's our last shot. So the next mayor and the city council, their job should be, in my judgment, to try to keep the city afloat until we can get there. And that's going to be some very hard decisions that aren't being made now, making government more efficient, using modern management practices, using technology, AI, and including in areas like public safety where there's cameras and drones and other things can be deployed, and get us there, because I think there is perhaps at that point the ability to organize the will of the people to save the city and the state from fiscal disaster. But that's where we're clearly headed right now. I mean, 40% of the budget now is debt service and pensions, and it's going to be growing exponentially in the years to come, which means fewer cops, fewer teachers, fewer garbage pickup people, fewer potholes filled, you name it.
Let me turn to New York, where it seems very likely that a precious 33-year-old man with no record of private sector W-2 employment is likely to be elected the next mayor of New York City. Now, let's be fair. Zohran Mamdani also does not have a track record of sexually harassing 13 different women. If I were a resident of New York, I probably would vote for Zohran Mamdani, even though I have some disagreements on policy with him. What does the election of Mamdani say about the current state of center-left politics in American cities? And what do you think the center-left political coalition should be learning ahead of the 2027 election cycle from what's happening in New York?
Yeah, another great question. I don't think that his nomination in New York is a sign that the Democratic Party should embrace far left policies, or that's the future. I think it's anomalous in some ways, as you point out. It's every election is binary choice, right? So the choice that the voters were asked was essentially someone, like you said, a serial harasser who had resigned office over his treatment of women, and then also a indicted and then pardoned incumbent mayor who was indicted for federal crimes. So I wouldn't read too much into that. I mean, I think there's a certain charisma that he has, and a certain demagoguery on prices and rent control and things like that in New York that were popular. But I think New York may be ending up kind of making the mistake that Chicago has done in the last two elections, which is elevating a rank amateur to one of the most difficult jobs in the country. And we've seen the results of that in Chicago, and just the remarkable unraveling of all this, so many of the accomplishments and so much of the progress of the previous 30 years. Experience matters, and I think in the next election, I think what voters should be looking for is that level of experience, not just experience tied to actual accomplishment. So the person has the skill and ability to achieve what needs to be done, and then we also get away from sort of this kind of ideological overlay that Brandon Johnson has added, this sort of far left perspective in addition to his inexperience, and that's been a very toxic combination.
So about the last 30 years, let me turn to your book. Here it is. I read it cover to cover in just a few days. I really enjoyed it. I'm not just saying that because you've agreed to be on my podcast. I moved here to Chicago during Mayor Daley's twilight years as mayor, and I took a class of his at the Harris School of Public Policy. He taught a class in the initial 1 or 2 years after his time as mayor. I was a student in that class. The class was about Mayor Daley's legacy as he saw it. What do you think Mayor Daley's legacy is?
Yeah, I wrote the book, which is called The Daley Show, not like the one on television with Jon Stewart, but with the Daley show, because I thought there were lessons from his tenure that are timeless, that can be applied throughout municipal governments in the country at a time when cities are struggling, and certainly in Chicago. And it was sort of cathartic too, because of what I'm kind of watching what had happened in the years since he left office, particularly the last really 8 to 10. And he, and the lessons of those lessons are important because cities are important. And as I say at the beginning of the book, history shows that cities have generally been the engines of human progress, and that's not a surprise because they attract ambitious people who want to work collaboratively with other talented and ambitious people in close proximity, and cities provide the scale and the density to achieve great things in science and technology and architecture and arts. And so even if you don't live in a city or don't think you even like cities, you should care about cities, and how they're governed matters enormously, and leadership is the single most important factor. So Daley's years in office as a whole were transformative. and lifted the city out of a historical morass. When he came into the office, the Chicago Tribune had run an investigative series saying Chicago was a city on the brink, an economic invalid. And there were people, John McCarran, who was an urban writer for the Tribune, said that when he began covering the city in the 70s and 80s, the question was, would the last person to leave Chicago please turn out the lights? And Daley, in 22 years, turned around the city. He revived the schools, the housing, the commercial sector. Parks. He made the city and improved the city of life dramatically. So much so that by the time he left office, Foreign Policy magazine had named Chicago one of the most important cities in the world. And Chicago had elevated itself to a global mecca. And that's a remarkable story. At the same time, the book is warts and all, and I talk about the scandals, I talk about the failures, and there are lessons there too, because I point out that to be effective as a leader, you have to understand power, and you have to be able to use it effectively. But if that power goes unchecked, it leads inevitably to corruption, which it did in Daley's administration. When he got in trouble with the feds in contracting and patronage scandals, he was riding the highest. The city council wasn't just approving his agenda, it was approving them routinely 50-0 because of the power he had accumulated. So I think there's an enormous number of lessons in the book, but I also think the most important ones were just telling the story of how this leader turned around one of the great cities that was in the abyss and led it to international acclaim in just 2 decades.
Interesting. So, of course, Mayor Daley was mayor in the late 80s through the 90s and early 2000s, in a time that the city of Detroit, similarly rooted in manufacturing, went one direction. The city of Chicago, Mayor Daley, to an extent, was able to lay a floor underneath our regional economy, largely by a strategic pivot towards services and embrace of the creative class. However, the economic progress that was made, or at least the lack of free fall that we saw in Detroit during that time period, did this embrace of professional services and the creative class lay the groundwork for later social division between the two Chicagos that maybe Mayor Daley's opponents and the Chicago Teachers Union and Mayor Johnson have politically exploited?
I don't think so, because I think people who argue that don't remember what Chicago was like in 1989. It was a very small number, a shrunken downtown, and a very small number of neighborhoods that were truly elite or even middle class. And over 22 years, because of his economic development policies, because of his affordable housing policies, which were very successful, because of doing things like tearing down the cancer of the public housing high-rises, one of his great, if not greatest accomplishment in my view, his revitalization of the public schools and attraction of middle-class families back to city life, building new parks, including Millennium Park, but also extraordinary investments in neighborhood parks and recreational programs for families. All these things contributed to job creation and growth and a higher quality of life. So, when I first moved to Chicago, everybody said, well, whatever you do, don't buy a house, west of Ashland. And then a few years later, it was like, whatever you do, don't buy a house, west of Damon. And then whatever you do, don't buy a house west of Western. And just, and so over time, these neighborhoods became more middle class. There were urban pioneers who were followed by followed by entrepreneurs, which are followed by home builders. So, I think that's a mythology. There's this sort of mythology that somehow there was Daley widened class. He actually shrunk them, and he crossed racial lines in a way that brought people together ethnically and otherwise. And I think President Obama recognized that. I think all the editorial boards when he left office gave him great credit for bridging those racial divides, which had made Chicago according to the Wall Street Journal, Beirut on the Lake back in the early 80s, in terms of the racial divisions and this essentially the Civil War that was always the undercurrent before he became mayor.
So Harold Washington, of course, Mayor Daley's predecessor, has a library named after him, has been cited as an inspiration by the current mayor, the previous mayor, and Barack Obama. Does Mayor Richard M. Daley deserve a similar veneration?
Well, I think absolutely, and they were both critical to Chicago history. I mean, Harold Washington, by winning election as the city's first black mayor, and then winning re-election over his obstructionist white enemies, including Ed Verdoliak, who led opposition on the city council to him, was really important. I think it settled white fears. The sky didn't fall because all of a sudden that there was a African American and there was equity in racial hiring and equity in contracting, and he really laid the foundation in many ways for Daley to come in and be successful. But both were important. Daley then managed the city in such a way and with a vision that built upon that and took Chicago to new heights. So I think both leaders deserve to be venerated for sure.